Okay, we will start again now. So if you could please find your seats. Okay, we will start. First, there is another practical information, and Joachim, if you could wave your hand. Everybody sees Joachim there. He is the guy to talk to if you want to attend any of the workshops, for students tomorrow or for everyone on Saturday. Our next speaker is a professor in digital culture here at UIB, and aside from her explorations of Snapchat, she has done some great research on blogs and electronic literature. Please welcome Professor Jill Rettberg.
Thank you very much. And thanks to Yusuf for that fabulous presentation. I think we were all really excited to hear all that. I'm going to talk about live stories on Snapchat, which is great because Yusuf really laid a groundwork for me to say some things about that. My conclusion is going to be that this is a really important part of our public sphere today, but it's privatized, which is something we need to think about. So, next. This was the first time I really got Snapchat, and I researched social media, so, you know, I got an account right back when it was very early, and I had no idea what it was because none of my friends were on Snapchat, and I'm guessing, I'm 45, I'm guessing a lot of you who are about that age had the same experience. What is this thing? Now, if you put a selfie lens in front of pretty much anyone of any age, I'm sure they're going to laugh, they're going to play, they're going to smile. This stuff's fun. I'm not a newcomer to social media. I've studied digital culture. I'm a professor of digital culture. I've written books about gaming, about blogging, about selfies. And even so, I didn't get Snapchat until last year. I started blogging, though, about actually more than 16 years ago when I came across blogger.com, push button publishing. It promised it would take 5 minutes to set up my own blog, and I was thrilled, and of course I did that instantly. I started blogging hoping that everyone would read what I wrote, so I wrote in Norwegian, but nobody blogged in Norway, so I switched to English. You know, 16 and a half years later, I'm still at it. Although blogging changes, it's much easier to blog when you're an outsider, when you're a newcomer, I found, than when you're an established person. Like, here's me trying to blog as head of department. That's a very different situation from being a fresh PhD student writing about academia from outside. So I'm quite interested to hear Yusuf's experiences from being, you know, the newcomer journalist who's out doing something new to suddenly running the mobile media division. It's a different thing. But you can retain some of that energy, I think, by just keeping trying new things, which is what I did with Snapchat. So Snapchat's very different now to what it was 5 years ago. It is a news platform. You go on there, and even if you have no friends at all, there's live stories, there's discover feeds, and there are a lot of storytellers like Yusuf, like other influencers who you can follow, even if you're not friends with them. So the first thing I did on Snapchat when I figured out how stories work was I thought, okay, I need to start making stories. And the selfie lens has fascinated me, and I'm really interested in biometrics and surveillance. So I thought, okay, I'll try making a research story.
Don't you love the selfie lenses? See that grid? Snapchat needs to convert our faces into data so that it can run the algorithm that lets it do the filters. When we use the selfie lens, our faces become data that can be manipulated. This book by Kelly Gates really had me thinking about surveillance, and
You guys can watch the rest of that later if you want, because I, being a bit of an anal researcher, actually archived most of my research stories. For me, trying to do stories as a researcher on Snapchat was incredibly valuable. My goal was to make a research story every day for a month, and that was a really good way to learn how it worked. As you can see, my first one, I'm a little bit, it's weird talking to a camera on your own. I've watched many other people's stories, but it takes a bit of time to get used to that. But Snapchat has so much fun built into it that it's playful, it's fun to do, The other really useful thing about using something like Snapchat is those 10 seconds. It limits you. So you record yourself saying something. It's very obvious if it took you more than 10 seconds. And you watch it immediately. You get instant feedback. You can tell if it sucks. And then you just record it again and again and again until it's okay. And then you post it to your story. And it's done. You can't do anything about it. Stories from individuals are only one part of Snapchat. One of the main things that interests me about Snapchat now is that it's becoming a public sphere. It's becoming a space for news, not just traditional news, but a sort of public discussion space for so many people. I think 36% of all Norwegians over the age of 18 use Snapchat every day. How many of you use Snapchat every day? Pretty good. I'm not sure if that's 36. Well, maybe you're not quite representative. And one of the aspects of how this is a news space is things like the geofilters, the infographics that you get live. This is from one of the early presidential or the primary debates in the US. But then live stories are another really interesting aspect of it. Now, live stories are curated by Snapchat, and it's individual snaps. So, for instance, if there was a live story running here now, there hasn't been a live story in Norway, I think, since, well, the 17th of May, the National Day, there's always a live story. Sometimes there are ones about specific things too. But say it was the 17th of May, and you're taking photos of the procession and people eating fancy food and stuff, and there's an option to send that snap to the live story. When you do that, it goes to a pool, and there are curators sitting at Snapchat that pick out the best snaps, or the snaps they think will be most interesting to people, and they put that together into a live story, which then can be viewed by anybody who has the Snapchat app. So it's what Yusuf was describing, but on a grand scale, public for everyone who has Snapchat. About a year or two ago, the CEO of Snapchat said to the press that 20 or 30 million people view every live story on average. And then there's been varying reports since. Maybe it's stagnating, maybe not. It's very unclear. And because it's not a public company, we don't have the exact numbers on that. But the live stories are certainly still there. Every day there's something. In the US, you see more live stories. Right now they have, for NFL football, there is, I think every game is there, and they have a deal with NFL where NFL pays them for this content being there. And you also see certain other events, like a fashion week or some event where it's clearly a kind of content marketing, right, where there's been a special package of live stories around this event. But regular live stories can be about all sorts of things. Very often they're about rituals, and I think this is really interesting because the kind of stories you can tell in a live story are communal, ritual, they're sort of repetitions, they're events. And I'd be really interested to think about how that is different from the sorts of curated stories that Yusuf is telling. So graduation, 17th of May, national holidays are very typical. Sports events, concerts, also very typical. Often they'll provide special filters, like right down at the bottom here you can see that is like a special graduation filter. And this was available on a Saturday in the US where very many colleges and universities in the US would be having their graduation ceremonies. So they're predictable days. Some of the live stories are more kind of, rather than being collective and we're all similar, they're more like, this is weird, but we're all shared. There's very much a cleared sort of ideal audience, which is this sort of global English-speaking we all get this together. There's also seems to be a fair bit of sort of almost educational intent in this. It's very clearly a young liberal US slant on things. So there'll be a lot of gay pride events. There'll also be Ramadan and other Muslim celebrations where there's clearly a fair bit of education happening here. Like one of the other Ramadan life stories has a lot of young women Muslims speaking very good English and explaining the different aspects of the day. But also the 17th of May celebration in Norway had this sort of educational, let's educate the world about this. So there's, which I think this is interesting, this sort of educational aim, because it's similar to public broadcasting's aim traditionally, although it's done in a different way. Also, for the Ramadan, for instance, there are often filters that are globally available. So it's not just the live story. You have a live story about Ramadan where you see curated content from the celebration, but you also have the opportunity to use your own selfie lens. And I saw my 12-year-old niece posted one of these with a pretty selfie. My neighbor used this filter to post a photo of her dog eating. It's the sort of sincerity with which it's used is probably quite varying. Some of the stories are more serious. This is for this September 11th. I was in the US at the time, so I don't know whether this was shown globally, but in the US, on September 11th, they had this memorial story, and it was pitched as being told by the New York City Police Department. And you can see there's quite a lot of informational material overlaid here, like this timeline, which is clearly a journalistic addition, right? And it's also interesting, this is a 15-year memorial, and it's primarily aimed at people who would have been very young children at the time that September 11th happened. So it's a different kind of telling to what we might have seen in other stories. But the communal aspects of it, I feel, are really important. This is from after the Orlando shootings last summer. There was, the day after, there were vigils held all over the United States, and there were live stories about this, which had this very carefully sort of planned curation. They start off with this moment of silence at 6 p.m., which was the time that the vigils started. The candles. There's information, it starts off outside the Stonewall and it says this bar was home to the 1969 Stonewall riot. So there's a lot of information being added here. But all the individual snaps that were used in here are shot by somebody who's in the crowd. And somebody asked about sound earlier. The sound in these live stories is really interesting because it's very much in the crowd. I'm at the back. We're singing a song, and you can hear my voice and the person next to me's voice. It sounds very, very different from a professionally produced thing that's shot from a distance. And I think that is the key thing about Snapchat that we need to remember when we're telling stories. They made an exception by including a bit. Obama had just a sentence. And interestingly, Obama's snap is 12 seconds long, so Obama gets more than 10 seconds. But again, here, what they did was they went around the country, vigils all around the United States. There were candles, there were flowers, the same songs were being sung. We had a gay men's choir walking outside the White House singing "We Shall Overcome," and then the next verse is actually from San Francisco. So there's a lot of very careful editing involved in this. But it's also a sort of material, a sort of event which is genuinely communal. The other news events that I've seen, at least that you can see from Norway, are also political but mass events. It's, for instance, Brexit. They had a live story of everybody going and voting, and then it kept going, as the fact of Brexit became apparent with all the responses from different people, and there were politicians also who were cut in. But David Cameron's speech, it may have been shot by a journalist, but it certainly wasn't a journalist at the front, there was very clearly a crowd. It was shot from behind the crowd, for instance. And they hire people specifically. If you go look at Snapchat's job ads, there are lots of jobs available, and many of them are specifically to curate this kind of content. Here's a part-time assistant story editor whose job would just be to find those snaps, because you can imagine how many millions of snaps get uploaded to a live story. But there's also higher level people, obviously, and this one specifically to work with news. Now, Snapchat is ephemeral, right? Things disappear, and that's really weird to us. Except it might not be. I feel like as an old person of 45, I expect things to be archived, to be there forever. But actually, old media was pretty ephemeral. We always threw out yesterday's newspaper. Wendy Chan is a researcher who's pointed out that this idea that the web is about storage and the archive is actually really an odd idea. It's almost an ideological sort of mistake. Because really, digital media is degenerative, it's forgetful, it's erasable. All this technology is just not reliable. This is a definition of social media, actually social network sites. It's been quoted over 11,000 times. It's on every syllabus on social media. And it describes Facebook, basically. It says, you know, you have a profile, you have connections, there's an archive, and that's not how Snapchat works. Basically, Snapchat just is exactly the opposite of that, which makes it hard, I think, for older people to understand it. But if we remember that actually digital media is inherently forgetful, even when we store things on paper, paper can burn, disks can degenerate, magnetic charges, they disappear, and electrical charges too. Even writing, you know, people worry about how about the ephemerality, about the durability of what we write. Facebook, a few years ago, tried to introduce Timeline, which is supposed to be, you know, sort of a total archive of me on Facebook. Have you noticed that sort of disappeared now? It doesn't really work. And this kind of store everything data app, this one logged every place I was at and tried to categorize it for me, is something we're actually fighting as a population. So I think embracing that ephemerality of Snapchat is quite crucial. It's also a real similarity between Snapchat, for instance, and television. We used to think, well, 30 years ago, we were used to media disappearing. But many people view each of these live stories. And I think that's why it's so repetitive. It's graduations. When there was a weekend this summer where almost everyone was getting married, you know, one of those May weekends that has a lovely date to it. And of course, Snapchat did a live story on weddings. There are a lot of people who get married. Graduations, first day back at school, various rituals that we do again and again. These are things that really work well in live stories. So I've been trying to work on a research project about analysing live stories, but when I presented a draft at the Norwegian Media Researchers Conference back in September, a friendly colleague said, "This is great, but did you check the terms of service? Are you allowed to be recording all those live stories like you have been?" You might have wondered why there's no video in my presentation. I checked the terms of service. And this, I think, is actually a real problem. Snapchat says about live stories that live services are inherently public and chronicle matters of public interest. I think they're right. This is public. It's very public. If 30 million people view this content and it is accessible to any user of Snapchat for 24 hours, that's public. That's pretty important. However, you're not allowed to archive it, you're not allowed to download it, you're not allowed to copy it. Now, you can take a screenshot, you can download your own story, although you could read that as being against the terms of service too, but the app allows it, so I'm going to assume it's permissible. But if you're a scholar or a librarian or anyone who's sort of interested in actually understanding the public sphere today, this is quite severe that you're not allowed to archive any of these live stories. So I'm hoping the screenshots I showed today are okay, because according to Norwegian intellectual property law, and luckily we have Jon Vestlås, a media lawyer, who may tell me otherwise after lunch. But I think it's permissible to have shown the screenshots because this is a church service or education, one or the other. But basically, I think this is a big concern that we need to think about, because Snapchat and other services like it are privatizing the public sphere. I think when Yusuf Omar talks about curating news stories, much in the same way that Snapchat does with live stories, but doing this for other organizations and then releasing it in other ways, I think that's fabulous, especially if it's done in an open way where people can actually see it and see it in the future. But if we're limiting our sharing, our social media journalism, our public debate only to private platforms, which can, at a snap of a change of terms of terms of service, just take it away, then I think we have a real problem as a democracy and as a group of people who actually want public debate to be open and accessible to all. Thank you very much. Maybe everyone's hungry for lunch. Come and talk to me later or send me a snap. You can add me there. Thank you.